Hello everyone and welcome to the Milan Sharma Show. I'm your host Milan, and today I will be doing a reaction video from a clip between Piers Morgan and Jordan Peterson. So they both had a discussion, I believe, several weeks back, and this is on the topic of young people being demoralized and anxious. So I'm really curious about this because as a 22-year-old myself, there's lots of things to be concerned about, to be worried about for the younger generation, Generation Z, as far as economically, mental health, etc. So many topics and subjects to get into. So let's just play this, and I'd like to react to it here.
Well, welcome back to this special edition of Piers Morgan Uncensored, one-on-one with Dr. Jordan Peterson. We left them on the cliffhanger with Rocky Balboa and his address to his son about how to grow a pair, for want of a better phrase. This idea that actually your life is defined not so much by success, because you're everyone's friend when you're successful, but by the knocks you inevitably are going to get, whether it's through losing loved ones, losing a job, losing a car, whatever it may be. You're going to get hit by blows in your life of differing magnitude. Mm-hmm. And I've always believed that how you deal with the downside of life really defines how you lead the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm. Well, the clip is very interesting because it starts out with the...
For the record, I agree with Piers Morgan on this, but let's see what Dr. Peterson has to say about that.
Admission that life is brutally difficult and sometimes unbearably brutally difficult. And you can see the progressives playing with that notion. It's warped into this sense of victimization, but it does reflect some understanding of the underlying tragic reality of life. And so it's good to get that right out on the table to begin with. Say, well, you're miserable, you have your reasons. And they might be deep reasons. But if you let the misery demoralize you and make you bitter and cynical and cowardly and make you withdraw, then first of all, that's a failure in the highest sense on your part, and all it's going to do is make everything worse. And then you might think, well, what do you have to respond to that? How do you respond to that catastrophe and challenge? And the answer is, and this is what Rocky is telling his son in no uncertain terms, is like, terrible as things are, there's a lot more to you than you can possibly imagine. And that if you face those things forthrightly and with some faith and courage, then you can have the adventure of your life and prevail even over catastrophe.
That's really, he makes a lot of really good points, and I can't cover every single point, obviously, because they're all fantastic. But one thing that really jumps out to me is when he said that obviously you're going to get hit, you're going to get punched in the mouth by certain, metaphorically I mean, but you're going to get hit in the mouth with all types of problems, conflicts, drama, regardless of whatever happens in life. I think Dr. Pearson makes a fantastic point with saying that being cynical and being cowardly in responding to that pain is what makes it really bad for you. Because if you, and it's a failure, and I agree with that, it's a hard thing to say, but I do believe it is a failure on your part if you allow yourself to spiral downward and to devour yourself in the sadness, to, like, in the midst of all the sadness and conflict going on, allowing yourself to be isolated with your emotions, where you're not seeking help and you're just all of a sudden allowing these horrible things to take over your life rather than seeking guidance, maybe seeking therapy, friends. If you don't have friends, seeking a peer group, a support group, things like this that are supposed to aid yourself and others to deal with trauma and terrible things that happen to you. So I think Dr. Peterson has said a really good point in saying this. And I think, even though it's hard for people to say that it's a failure to act on yourself, because it is a failure, because you're not looking out for yourself, you're not caring for yourself when you don't act out, and you don't take actions to better your situation. Even though a situation may not be better, at least take actions to aid yourself in dealing with those hardships.
That's true.
Right. So, I couldn't really get my head around why so many young people feel so anxious all the time, compared to when I was young, when that wasn't really a big thing amongst my friendship group, certainly. But I reckon it's two things. One, social media. the constant bombardment of other people having a great time or looking great, often a false imagery, and that having to live up to false ideals.
That's a great point by Piers Morgan. I fully agree with that. My parents, my grandparents didn't have social media. They didn't have something to constantly compare themselves with, a standard to compare themselves with, whether that's beauty, whether that's physical fitness, whether that's going on vacations every year, the amount of money spent on certain outfits for women or like makeup or all these things. These standards were never even the case back in the other generations. Now they did have other problems for sure, no question about that. They did have issues to deal with, not discounting that they had this fantastic upbringing. However, they didn't have, like, the internet's on your phone, the internet's on 24/7. There's never a break. You can put it up at 4 in the morning, you can bring it up at 9 in the morning. You can do it whenever you want. So when people have that access to do that, all of a sudden they're going to check their phone and see what Nancy or Paula or whoever, whatever they're up to, and they're on this new vacation every other month. Obviously, there's going to be sadness that develops within oneself because they're not doing those things. They're suffering from FOMO. So this never-ending cycle is something that we've never seen before the 21st century, and that's really what I believe is peddling so much anxiety and anxiousness in people. But let's continue here.
But also a conversation I had with Dr. Phil in America, where his explanation for it was that he said, you've got to understand that social media means that young people now are being bombarded all day long and all night long with quite shocking imagery. And he gave an example. He said, when I was young, he said, if a crocodile ate somebody on a golf course in Florida, chances are I would never have heard about it. It probably wouldn't have made the national news, probably wouldn't have even made the state news, and I wouldn't have heard about this incident. Now, it's quite likely that a video of the crocodile eating this person would be whipping its way around social media within half an hour. And young kids would be sharing it, disseminating it, and being exposed to this constant imagery all the time of quite unsettling and shocking imagery. What do you think of that theory? And
I think
that in itself was adding to a sense of everything's terrible.
Well, I think it's a corollary of an information overload theory, right? I mean, one of the advantages to having the computational power we have is that everything is at your fingertips. And the disadvantage is that everything's in your face. And by everything, it might be 40 million pornographic images. Like, that's a lot. Or an endless array of tragic scenarios. And really endless. And so that's a problem. And the fundamental problem is, how do you handle the fire hose of information? And no one really knows the answer to that.
Yeah, Dr. Peterson makes a great point here. And also, I believe at least like 5 to 8 years ago when I was in high school, I learned something very interesting from my teacher. And he said that at least in our world history, we're in one of the most peaceful times. However, when you look at news, when you follow news stations, and they're always stoking fear and they're always showing the bad news because bad news heightens ratings, when people see that all the time and see all this bad news and this, like the world's going to end and all these things, people are going to be fearful of the world. They think that the world's unsafe. And yes, sure, there's things going on in the world that aren't safe, at least in the United States, that haven't happened before. Like terrible things. Though when you look at the worldwide scale, it's actually very peaceful as far as us not being in a constant war, at least a declared combat war right now. We're in a very peaceful time. But you wouldn't know that if you're looking at news stations constantly, such as Dr. Pearson's saying, when it's always in your face.
But we should also point out that it's no wonder that young people are demoralized and anxious, because we're doing everything we can to demoralize them and make them anxious. So on the masculine front, we tell young boys that, well, the world's a terrible patriarchal tyranny, and all of that patriarchal tyranny, which is the whole explanation for history, has done nothing but oppress and exploit people and destroy the planet. And so that any manifestation of that masculine impulse on your part is equivalent to the world-destroying force.
Well, all masculinity now is branded toxic.
Yeah.
And I remember, I think the key moment for me came when Gillette, who'd always had these very masculine commercials with the big guy cuddling a baby or whatever it may be. They suddenly switched gears and did a campaign where it started with a lot of Me Too imagery and basically the assumption that all men are awful until they can prove otherwise. And I predicted in a column this would be a complete disaster for them. And sure enough, $9 billion later, they did a screeching U-turn and went back to the big guy cuddling the babies. Because actually, two things I think about that. One, most men are not awful, actually. And secondly,
not all the time.
No, some men are, obviously. Some women are pretty awful, but not most of them. But if you try saying that and not getting cancelled. But I think also this thing that you've got into trouble about, which I don't understand why, that you believe that most women probably quite like their men to be strong and confident.
I don't believe that. All the data shows that clearly across cultural samples and has for 50 years. Plus, everyone knows it.
Anecdotally, most women I know, I think, would absolutely agree. Why is it that you've been so vilified for suggesting something which is so palpably true?
Well, I think, first of all, that annoys narcissistic women no end. And it annoys people who think that there are no biological or cultural limits on how we manifest our behaviors. And also, it frightens a large number of women because many women have never had a good relationship with anyone masculine in their life. And so the notion that they would need to establish a trusting relationship with a man, especially if he's also in something approximating a superordinate position, which is what they might like to find him maximally attractive, also implies that they're in some sense going to be under his sway. And if there's no trust there, well, that's absolutely terrifying. And I have some sympathy for that because there are no shortage of women out there who've never had a positive relationship with anyone masculine. And so they're completely unable to discriminate between narcissistic power and compulsion and confident competence.
Narcissistic compulsion. Let me read that, or let me replay that. It's very fascinating.
Masculine. And so they're completely unable to discriminate between narcissistic power and compulsion and confident competence.
Narcissistic power and compulsion and confidence, or confidence and competence. I really agree with that a lot, and I think it's fascinating because I think it's very dangerous to generalize any group of people, whether it's a specific gender or a specific, ethnicity, race, all those things, religion, etc. It's very dangerous to generalize because when people do that, you fail to see the individual for who they may be. So, for example, like if a woman is saying like there's such thing as toxic masculinity, there's a very real possibility that that woman may have had poor experiences with certain men in their lives, that they associated these poor traits with masculine behavior, when in reality, competence and confidence, I believe those two C's are more related to masculinity than narcissistic power that may have been associated with that woman or women that they viewed as threatening to them. And I think it's really bad to say toxic masculinity because that term is so broad; it can be used for so many different things. I'm much more supportive of pointing out certain behaviors as being toxic, because when you point out certain behaviors, then you're more likely to have more awareness around those behaviors, and that people can be more careful and strategic in how they form relationships in their lives. So, for example, if I were to, let's say I'm like, there's toxic femininity in the world, and I'm telling my friends that. If my friends have awareness, they're going to say, what does that even mean? What's toxic about femininity? What specifically? And, and then I go into those details. But my point is there needs to be a prescription for what is toxic behavior and what is good behavior. So mutual respect, treating everyone very well, compatibility, having shared values and healthy relationship, all these things are shared meaning, shared positive. These sorts of traits facilitate a positive relationship. That's my point, really. And I think when you go to the toxic things, such as abuse, all different forms of abuse, and gaslighting, all those things. When you say gaslighting, yelling, cursing, maybe infidelity, if that happens, all these things, these are toxic things. And I believe that these traits need to be pointed out rather than saying toxic masculinity, because some people could have good traits, and that are positively associated with masculinity. For example, I associate masculinity with, like Dr. Pearson said here, confidence, being strong, both physically and mentally. And thirdly, and this could be controversial, but the ability to set aside one's emotions for a limited time to make the best decision moving forward in life. And this could be for a variety of different things. So when there's a stressful situation and a man's dating a woman and the woman is looking to the man for a clear decision in the midst of stress and conflict, having the ability to do that in a very mature, sophisticated manner, I believe, is a really powerful trait that a relationship can really flourish on. And I think that's a positive thing in a masculine trait. That's why I'm really not a huge fan of saying toxic masculinity or toxic femininity and all that. So, with all those in mind, all those things I mentioned in mind, thank you so much for listening, everyone. If you'd like to listen to any of my longer form podcasts and interviews, you can check the Apple Podcast link in the description below. And please subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate it. It really helps me out a ton. Like the video, comment whether you like this or if you hate this video. I don't really care. Whatever you think. If you hate it, if you love it, comment below. And thank you so much for watching, everybody. Really appreciate it.